purpose of this video is to talk about the life of St. Francis of Assisi, and just to give you a brief overview of who he is. Now, even before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about the potential problems in even learning about Francis. This is what scholars call the Franciscan question. Oddly enough, we probably know more about Francis than any other medieval saint. We have a lot of biographies and hagiographies written about him. But yet, the questions that we bring, the perspectives that we bring as moderns often shape how we see Francis. So also he was a Catholic saint, so finding really the true Francis, if you will, requires digging behind the hagiographies. These are biographies meant to explain the life of a saint as a saint. And so we have to think about what's actually going on in some of these stories. And additionally, of course, he was a saint. And so as a saint, he could appear to be so holy to some of us that we think he's not somebody that we can imitate, though Francis, of course, would say that that's not the case. Additionally, one of the things that's a very contemporary issue in dealing with Francis is all too often people like to use Francis as a mouthpiece for their own ideas. They like to use him for their own ideological purposes. So sometimes in the early part of the 19th century, 20th century, people thought of him as a proto-Protestant. In the 70s, he was envisioned as kind of a medieval hippie, if you will. He gets used for lots of different purposes. So oftentimes people try and domesticate him to make him to be like themselves. And in fact, of course, he lived 800 years ago, and so it's quite different. Additionally, one of the things about Francis is if you really pay close attention to his life, I think he'll make you uncomfortable. He challenges our assumptions about what's important, about who we are, about who we should love, about what's important. And so the more you begin to really engage in who Francis is, I think the more that you'll find yourself to be challenged by this man. He should make you uncomfortable. I think that's one thing I can say for sure. Now, his early life begins in 1181, 1182. He was born to Pietro and Pica Bernardone in Assisi. This is a town in Italy. His mother actually named him Giovanni, John, but his father didn't like that, so he just named him Francesco. And in Italian, that really just means Frenchy. Now, his father spent a lot of time in France selling cloth, and I think this is why. So he received a basic education, probably the equivalent of about an 8th grade education, which was all that was necessary for a merchant at that time. But he did, because he traveled with his father to France, become fluent in French. And in fact, his father had a cloth business, and his father would travel up to the medieval fairs in France on a regular basis to sell his cloth up there. And Francis joined him on those trips, and that's one of the ways he became so fluent in his French. Now, Francis was known personality-wise, his temperament for being friendly, very generous. He was the kind of guy who would pick up the tab at the bar, if you will. He was very charismatic, and many of the early hagiographies said he enjoyed partying a fair amount too. Now, when he was 18, the city of Assisi went to the war, 18, maybe 20, went to the war between Assisi and Perugia. This is two cities that were at war with each other because Italy was organized by cities, not as a nation state. It would be roughly equivalent to people in Baton Rouge going to war with the people in Lafayette. There was a battle at Collestrada, and he was captured there. Many of his friends were killed, so he witnessed that. He was actually held as a prisoner of war in Perugia in a pretty unsatisfactory dungeon for a year until his father was able to pay for him to return. He ransomed him away from his captors. He comes back a changed man, slightly withdrawn. In fact, what some scholars suggest is that he actually perhaps came back suffering from PTSD. As you can imagine, somebody who had seen many of his friends die and was spent a year as a prisoner would not have very happy experiences. So the biographers talk about how he spent a lot of time in isolation, how the partying and the things with his friends didn't interest him as much, how withdrawn he was, how sad he was. And so while it's always difficult to diagnose something that happened 800 years ago, PTSD is a really interesting idea of what his initial kind of response was to his year in prison. However, a few years later, he continues to think perhaps that he's going to go to war. He begins this time to join a war in southern Italy. His father buys him a horse and an armor and all the stuff he needs to go down. He gets all the way to Spoleto, where he has a mystical dream from God, where God says, you don't need to serve these false lords of war, but you need to serve me, the real Lord. And so he abandons his trip to the war. He, on his way back, sells all of his horse, all of his armor and everything, and keeps that money and returns on foot to Assisi. Now, on his way back to Assisi, he stops in this famous church, San Damiano. This is actually, at this point, a very rundown church out of Assisi. He spends the night there. He takes that money from the sale of his horse and armor, and he actually leaves it on the windowsill of the church. He doesn't want the money, in other words. The priest doesn't want the money either, because he's a little worried about what's going to happen with it, so they just leave it in a neutral spot. He continues to withdraw from life in Assisi. He begins to engage in frequent almsgiving, and in fact makes a pilgrimage to Rome and continues almsgiving there. And at one point, he even exchanges his clothes with a pauper just to see what it's like to beg as a pauper. He continues to visit San Damiano, praying before the crucifix. One of the earliest prayers we have from St. Francis is what's called the prayer before the crucifix. So this is something that's still there for us to read if we want. Now, what happens is his family becomes really concerned about Francis. The biographers, hagiographers present them as in a very negative light, but like any parent whose son has sort of disappeared or seems to be disturbed, they were worried about him. And of course, they also wanted some of that money back because it was quite expensive to have a horse and all that armor. They go looking for him. Francis actually hides from them in a hole for a good month or so. He finally gets out of that hole and returns to Assisi. So he's dirty, he's emaciated, and the people of Assisi think that he's gone mad. In fact, they tell him that you're crazy. His father asked the bishop to intervene. And so Francis meets his father in the presence of the bishop, where they have this confrontation. In fact, all of Assisi seems to be there. And the bishop says that Francis has to give back his father's money. So Francis takes the money, and he goes around the corner. He takes all of his clothes off, folds them up, puts the money on top, and walks back out, again, completely naked, and says that he renounces his inheritance. He doesn't want any of his father's wealth. In fact, he says, I no longer have a father except for the Father in heaven. So at this point, he's renounced all of his wealth, and his father was, of course, quite wealthy. So this is what I like to call his first renunciation, the renunciation of wealth. Francis is now naked, and he's poor. He walks to a Benedictine monastery, and they give him a shirt to wear, but it's snowing outside. He walks around in the snow, and ultimately he ends up settling with some lepers. They were perhaps the only people who would take him in, and he begins actually to care for them. Now, Francis locates in his own writings his time with the lepers as the beginning of his conversion. Before this, he had often thought of lepers as disgusting, as people he wouldn't want to be around. He said in his last testament that he viewed them as, he had a bitter response to them. And then he says, the Lord gave me the lepers, and what was bitter became sweet. And so he, in his own words, is very clear that his care for the people that nobody else cared for was the real beginning of his conversion to Christ. Now, for the next few years, what happens is he spends a time as a penitent. This is kind of a technical term for a person who is under the leadership of a cleric and working for the church. He lives and works among the lepers, and he spends a lot of time repairing the church at San Damiano. He would beg people in Assisi to give him money, and he would buy stones and whatever it needed to repair the church. Now, at this point, he has no followers, but beginning in the spring of about 1208, Bernard approaches Francis about joining him. So at this point, for 2 or 3 years, he's just been working alone. Bernard himself is quite wealthy and says he wants to follow Francis, and Francis says, that's great. You have to sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then follow Francis. And in this case, another person, Peter, begins to follow him as well. So now he goes from by himself to just having 2 followers. What happens is Francis and his new followers consult an altar missal, kind of an excerpt of the Bible, and they randomly picked 3 verses, just by flipping through the Bible, that shaped his understanding of the incipient brotherhood. And here are the key verses for Francis as recorded. This idea that one has to go sell what you own and give your money to the poor, from Mark 10:21. That when one travels, that one's not supposed to take anything, from Luke 9:3. And that one has to deny oneself and take up the cross to follow me, from Matthew 16:24. In some sense, these 3 verses really shape what will become the full expression of Franciscan life, but it's formed by this idea of the gospel. Now, to actually have a religious order required approval by the papacy. A short story, there had been a lot of religious movements in Europe at this point, many which had been sort of heretical, and so the papacy was very carefully trying to control the kind of religious orders that were formed. Now, Francis and his followers wanted to preach. That actually required also permission. So he takes, at this point, a group of 11. He's got a small group of followers. They travel to Rome to get an approval for their way of life. Here he meets with Pope Innocent III, probably the most powerful of all medieval popes, who gives them provisionally approval to continue, and he allows them to preach in a very restricted sort of way the need for people to receive penance or to act in a penitential way. They receive the tonsure, which is a symbol of their life, their committed life to the church. And eventually the 12 of them settle in a shed in Revo, just about a few miles from Assisi, and again close to a place where the lepers were living in San Lazzaro. New recruits begin to join, and Francis moves them to the Porziuncola, which is a place where they were all able to live. So he goes from 2 to 12, and now what happens is, because they're allowed to preach, the brothers begin to wander all throughout Italy. They're usually working in pairs. They work, they beg, they worship, and preach. Now, as you can see, the content of their preaching was to repent, to reform one's morals, to engage in peace and reconciliation. Francis begins to develop this reputation. He begins to be seen as a really holy person, a great preacher, and adept at spiritual direction. He actually wants to go to the Holy Land to preach, but bad weather forces him back to Italy. People think that he was really seeking a form of martyrdom. So this first trip to the Holy Land doesn't work. As you will see a little bit later, he does successfully make it to the Holy Land a little bit later. Now, in the midst of all this, he also develops his first set of female followers, primarily through Clare of Assisi. She had a cousin who was one of Francis's followers, and tells him that Clare wants to meet him. She kind of meets him, but of course these things had to be very carefully controlled in the medieval era. She was only 18, and she came from a very wealthy family. Now what happens is, on Palm Sunday, a signal is given, and Clare escapes her family and meets Francis and his brothers, who then essentially moves her to a Benedictine monastery before he can find a permanent residence for San Damiano. This becomes the first Franciscan convent. So these are Franciscans, or what we call the second order, the Clares, the poor Clares. She has a very similar rule to what the brothers followed, but she wouldn't get a formal approval for her rule almost until the end of her life. She was very insistent that she wanted to follow Francis's way of life, so much so that ultimately she bent the will of the Pope to her own end, toward the end of her life. So she's a very strong woman, and a lot of my female students find her very inspirational for her ability to get what she wanted against very strong forces. Now, in 1213, Francis actually receives a gift of land on Mount Laverna, where he will spend part of his life in a spiritual retreat. And this property is given to him, and he uses it. So this is a little mountain that he spends a lot of time on. This becomes very important in the last couple of years of his life, and so it's something we should be aware of. Now, also happening at this time, and this tremendously influences the life of the Franciscans, is in 1215, Pope Innocent calls a council, the Fourth Lateran Council. Francis may or may not have attended. There's stories saying he did, stories saying he did not. But there's some important rules that are laid out by the church here. One, the Pope says, and the Council says, that religious orders have to meet on a regular basis as chapters. They have to have meetings, and in fact, the Franciscans will do this. They have to get permission to preach and to take confession, and this is something that the Franciscans immediately engage in. And the Pope also forbids the formation of new religious orders, though the Franciscans somehow seem to have been exempt from this, perhaps because of their prior approval. By 1217, now think about this, in just probably less than a decade, there were probably fewer than 800 Franciscan brothers. That's actually really quite rapid growth. The brothers, again, continue to do mission work, now not just in Italy, but throughout Europe, but without a whole lot of initial success. They sent people off and did not go well. So Francis meets a cardinal of Ostia, which is a town near Rome, Cardinal Ugolino. He becomes incredibly important for the founding of the Franciscans, because he'll later become Pope Gregory IX and so on. But his initial role is just to help the Franciscans, and we'll see a little bit more about that in a second. Now, Francis finally gets his trip to the Holy Land, and so he makes a trip down to Egypt, where the Fifth Crusade is laying siege to a town called Damietta. And he arrives there in the fall. He crosses enemy lines. We're not sure entirely how that was accomplished, but he crosses enemy lines and obtains a audience with the Sultan, the one who's running that. He spends 2 or 3 days. Francis doesn't actually convert him, and he does preach to him. But a lot of people who were around were actually very engaged with Francis and saw him as being powerful, kind of a powerful and holy man as far as his preaching. He doesn't convert the Sultan, but he really does give an interesting model for Christian-Muslim relations here. However, Francis receives word that there's problems back at home with the Franciscan order, and so he actually has to return. What he finds out is that some of the brothers had tried to change the way of life from his original vision, and so he asked the Pope Honorius III for assistance. Here, Honorius appoints Ugolino, who we talked about a few minutes ago, as a protector of the order. What happens is the Pope and Ugolino exert authority on behalf of Francis, so Francis can really maintain his emphasis on being a lesser, on minority brothers. He's very wary of power, as we'll see in a little bit. Now, what happens is Honorius writes a letter on behalf of the brothers, and what he does is he asks bishops and priests in other dioceses to allow the brothers to preach without opposition, so they carry this letter with them anywhere they want to go to in Europe, and this actually allows their missionary work to be much more effective. Also, new members have to complete a year-long novitiate. Before, Francis would just kind of accept anybody randomly. That didn't always work out so well. And Francis has to begin to work on a new version of his rule of life. And then comes his second renunciation, Francis's renunciation of power. So this is at one of those chapter meetings that we talked about with regard to the Fourth Lateran Council. They're at a chapter meeting. Francis stands up and says, I will no longer be the leader of this order. And he gives all the responsibilities for the order over to a brother Peter. In fact, what Francis says, he says, give me a Franciscan novice, a new guy here, to be in charge of me, somebody that I then must obey. So, no power. Now, in the meantime, he's probably struggling from malaria, which he contracted in Egypt. He begins to withdraw from the order, spending more time in solitude, particularly in Laverna. But what happens is Brother Peter, who he left in charge, dies just after 6 months, and Brother Elias takes over as the administrator of the order. Now, in 1223, the final form of Francis's life, the later rule, will actually be approved by Pope Honorius, and this is the rule of life that Franciscans still follow today. It has elements of living the gospel in obedience without possessions and in chastity. You can see how brothers are supposed to live, with being meek, peaceful, modest, gentle, humble, and speaking courteously. Brothers were not allowed to receive money, but they were called to work. Francis was very wary of idle brothers. He thought that wasn't necessarily such a good thing. The brothers were to care for family members, or care for each other as family members. They had to confess their sins, and they had to engage in fraternal correction. And again, preaching is really important. but they have to have permission in order to do that. So a new rule. One of the things about Francis is he is really the first person to create a Christmas crèche near a local church in Greccio. He really appreciates the humility of the incarnation, the idea that God would become man, not just as an adult, but as a child, as a baby, but also saw a real connection between the incarnation and the making new of all of creation. But his health isn't so good, and he is continuing to be sick. Part of Francis's sickness was self-imposed because he engaged in long fast and so on. By 1224, he is actually able to travel to Laverna, where he lives in his mountain hermitage. He finds himself engaged in spiritual combat with demonic forces. This is a kind of something that seems to happen a lot with the saints in the Christian tradition. And he has a vision of a six-winged seraph, of an angel, who, as you can see from this picture, seems to appear to him on Laverna. Now what happens after this vision is he begins to manifest the stigmata. Now, contrary to what you see in a lot of art, the wounds in the wrist and in the feet weren't bleeding wounds, but actually fleshy protuberances. His flesh seemed to grow into the shape of nails, though he did have a suppurating wound on his side. These were to represent the wounds of Christ, and they were understood to have been a gift of the seraph to Francis. But Francis, out of his typical humility, was very uncomfortable with people seeing these, so he hid them. Only a few of his closest companions saw them during his life, but there are a lot of witnesses who saw them on his body after his death when he laid in repose in Assisi. So there's lots of eyewitnesses to this. His health continues to fail. He returns to San Damiano. Here he begins to write the Canticle of the Creatures. Now, this is often presented as a beautiful canticle towards creation, and it's certainly that, but it's actually being written in the midst of a severe eye disease. And so in this sense, it's a poetic expression of praise for God in the midst of suffering. In fact, as we'll see, the eye disease he had wouldn't permit him to go out and see the sun or fire. Any kind of light really bothered his eyes. And yet the very first thing he praises in creation is, in fact, the very things that cause him pain, the sun and fire and so on. So he heads back for medical treatment. In reality, he actually refuses his medical treatment. One of the things about Francis is he's actually a very difficult patient. Finally, Brother Elias, again, who's the Minister General of the whole order, actually commands Francis under his oath of obedience to receive care. He says, Francis, I'm ordering you under obedience to get care. And so he does that. And the way they treated that eye disease is they actually heated up a hot iron poker until it was glowing hot, and then cauterized his eye from his eye basically to his earlobe. As you can imagine, it actually didn't improve his situation at all. But there's a kind of funny story where he looks at the hot iron poker and says, Brother Fire, please be kind to me. Even though he was ill, people continued to come to him for miracles, prayer, and care. He's moved to Siena and Celle, and then finally back to Assisi in July. He's staying at a newly constructed Franciscan house, but doctors just give him a few months to live. He's asked to be taken back to the Porziuncola, which of course was one of the original locations of his brotherhood. He's surrounded by his brothers and priests, but rarely receives outside visitors. And then finally he dies on October 3rd, 1226. Immediately afterward, his body is carried to Assisi. It stops by San Damiano, where Clare and her sisters pay their respects. His body remains at a church there, but they build a basilica for his body, and that's permanently interred. You can see this is the crypt where his body is buried, many feet down below the altar. Cardinal Ugolino, who was the protector, becomes elected pope, and as Gregory IX, he makes Francis a saint in July of 1228. So just real briefly, just 2 years after his death, he becomes a saint. Now that's a brief overview of Francis's life. There's a lot more that you can read about. If you're interested, here's some additional books. Francis of Assisi, The Life by Augustine Thompson. The timeline of this particular presentation very much follows Thompson's book on this. I think it's an excellent book. Andre Vauchez talks about the life and afterlife, another good one. Dominic Monti has a very brief book on Francis and his brothers. It talks about what happens not just in Francis's life, but the Franciscan movement all the way towards the contemporary period. And then finally, the best way to learn about Francis is really just to read the biographies that were written about him during his life very carefully and thoughtfully. And that's where I think you'll find the deep challenge. But I hope this has given you a good overview of who Francis was, and that perhaps you'll find him somebody worthy of emulation and more study.